She came to finalize the divorce. Duke froze when he realized she was 8 months pregnant. The carriage arrived at Blackthorn Manor on a Thursday afternoon in late October of 1897, when the sky above the Derbyshire hills had grown the colour of pewter, and the oak trees lining the long gravel drive had surrendered their last leaves to the wind. It was not a day that invited arrivals. It was a day for drawing curtains, for settling into the silence that great houses keep when their occupants have long since stopped speaking to one another. Yet the carriage came nonetheless, wheels grinding against the frost-hardened stone, and with it came the particular tension that descends upon a household when the past presents itself at the front door without warning. The servants heard it first, as servants always do. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Partridge, a woman of considerable experience in managing the emotional climate of aristocratic households, stood at the tall window of the entrance hall and watched the carriage slow to a stop beneath the stone portico. She recognized the crest on the door before the coachman had descended from his seat. It was not the Blackthorn crest. It was the Whitmore crest, the family from which the Duchess had come, and to which, by all reasonable accounts, she had returned some 7 months prior, and from which she was not expected to emerge again in any formal capacity, except through the quiet, carefully managed dissolution of a marriage that had, in the estimation of most who observed it, run its course. Mrs. Partridge did not move immediately. She allowed herself one full breath, the kind that prepares a woman for what she already suspects will be a very long afternoon. And then she turned from the window and went to inform the Duke. Arthur Pembroke, the 9th Duke of Blackthorn, was in the East Library when the housekeeper found him. He was standing at the window in the manner of a man who has been standing at windows for some time, which was an accurate assessment, for he had developed the habit in recent months of positioning himself near glass, through which he could observe the grounds without being obliged to walk upon them. The estate was beautiful in autumn. It had always been beautiful. He had simply ceased to find beauty a sufficient reason to go outside. He was 34 years old. He had inherited the dukedom at 22, the title arriving simultaneously with the death of a father he had admired but never fully understood, and he had spent the intervening years conducting himself with the precision and restraint that such a position demanded. He was considered by those who moved in the same rarefied circles to be a man of exceptional composure. His judgments were measured, his silences were controlled, his emotions, if he possessed them in any quantity that others might recognize, were kept in the same locked wing of himself, where he kept everything he considered too fragile to expose to open air. He had married Eleanor Whitmore 3 years earlier, in a ceremony attended by 400 guests and reported upon in 4 separate London publications. The marriage had been considered advantageous by all parties, with an interest in such arrangements. The Whitmore family possessed lineage and reputation. The Blackthorn estate possessed the financial stability that lineage alone could not sustain. Eleanor was accomplished, composed, and possessed of a quiet intelligence that Arthur had recognized immediately and found, to his own considerable surprise, deeply compelling. He had not expected to be moved by his wife. He had not expected, when the negotiations were complete and the vows were spoken and the guests had eaten their fill and departed, to find himself standing in the hallway outside her suite of rooms and wondering what she was reading, or whether she had retired, or whether she too was still awake, listening to the house settle around them. He had not anticipated the particular quality of her attention when she listened, the way she turned her whole self toward a conversation, as though what was being said mattered more than what had already been decided. He had not anticipated any of it, and because he had not anticipated it, he had not known how to meet it with anything other than the composure that had served him adequately in every other area of his life. The marriage had been conducted with courtesy, with correctness, with the faultless observance of every requirement that society placed upon two people of their station. What it had not been conducted with was honesty of the quiet, unguarded kind that might have prevented the misunderstandings that accumulated one upon another through 2 years and 8 months of shared residence and carefully maintained distance, until the distance became the most truthful thing between them. Eleanor had left in March. She had not left in anger, which would have been, paradoxically, easier to bear. She had left in the manner of a woman who has arrived at a conclusion after long and private deliberation, and who has found the conclusion both reasonable and deeply sorrowful. She had written him a letter of such measured composure that it had taken him 3 readings to understand that she was not informing him of a temporary removal to her family's estate in Wiltshire, but of something far more permanent in its intention. She had written of incompatibility. She had written of mutual respect. She had written of the impracticality of continuing an arrangement that served neither party in any meaningful way, and she had done so in the handwriting he had watched move across documents and correspondence for nearly 3 years, the handwriting he had come to recognize as distinctly hers, precise without coldness, curved without sentimentality. He had not replied. This was, in the long catalogue of his misjudgments, the one that required the least examination and yet received the most. He had read her letter, and he had set it on the desk, and he had walked to the window, and he had stood there for a very long time. And then he had done what he had always done when confronted with something that threatened the architecture of his composure. He had continued. 7 months had passed. His solicitor had been in correspondence with the Whitmore family's solicitor. Certain documents had been prepared. The process, conducted with the discretion that both families required, was proceeding toward its quiet conclusion. He had not seen Eleanor since the morning she departed, when he had stood at the top of the steps and watched the carriage carry her away through the February mist, and he had pressed his hands against the cold stone of the balustrade and felt, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had managed everything very badly indeed. When Mrs. Partridge appeared in the library doorway and informed him that a carriage bearing the Whitmore crest had arrived at the front of the house, Arthur turned from the window with the particular stillness of a man whose composure is working very hard. He descended the main staircase at a pace that could not be described as hurried, because he did not hurry. but which was nonetheless faster than his usual measured tread. The entrance hall was high-ceilinged and cool, lit by the grey afternoon light falling through the tall windows on either side of the great front doors, and it smelled, as it always did in October, of wood smoke and beeswax, and the faint mineral sharpness of impending weather. The doors were already open. The footman had seen to that. And in the space framed by those doors, between the stone columns of the portico and the pale afternoon beyond, stood Eleanor. She had not changed in the ways he might have expected 7 months to alter a person. Her hair was the same dark auburn, arranged with the practicality she had always preferred over elaborate styling. Her eyes, when they met his across the entrance hall, were the same composed grey that had always given him the impression of great depth, carefully contained. She wore a travelling coat of deep burgundy that he did not recognize, something acquired evidently after her departure. And she was holding the handle of a small travelling case with both hands, which struck him, even in that first moment, as slightly unusual. And then his gaze completed its initial survey and arrived at the understanding that altered everything. The travelling coat could not conceal what 7 months had rendered unmistakable. Eleanor was with child. She was so visibly, undeniably, so entirely with child, that the fact seemed to fill the entrance hall alongside her, occupying its own considerable portion of the available space. The neat, contained silhouette he had known was entirely transformed. She stood differently, with the careful balance of a woman for whom every movement has become a considered act. And the curve of her was neither hidden nor announced, simply present, as fact tends to be when it has waited as long as it is willing to wait. Arthur stopped at the foot of the staircase. It is a difficult thing to describe what happens to a man of exceptional composure when composure is genuinely insufficient to the moment he is standing in. The experience does not announce itself dramatically. There is no outward evidence of the specific quality of stillness that overtook Arthur Pembroke at the foot of those stairs, except that he stopped, and he looked at his wife, and the portion of his mind that was always occupied with managing the impression he made upon the world went entirely, uncharacteristically quiet. The mathematics of the situation arranged themselves without invitation. Eleanor had left in March. She was, by every visible measure, 8 months into her confinement, which placed the beginning of this particular calculation in the final weeks of February. In the time before her departure. In the time when they had still been whatever else they had or had not been to one another, husband and wife residing beneath the same roof. He had not known. That was the fact that stood behind every other fact and made them all more difficult. He had not known, and she had left, and 7 months had passed in which solicitors had exchanged letters and documents had been prepared, and he had stood at various windows convincing himself that he had done what was necessary. And all the while, this had been true. Eleanor had not moved from the doorway. She was watching him with the expression he had always found most difficult to interpret, not because it was unreadable, but because it read too clearly. And what it read was something he had spent considerable effort avoiding the responsibility of acknowledging. She was watching him with the expression of a woman who has rehearsed this moment many times in private, and who is finding, now that it has arrived, that rehearsal was only partially adequate. She had come to finalize the divorce. He understood that. The timing of her arrival, so close upon the latest correspondence between their respective solicitors, made the purpose of her visit plain. She had come to conclude what they had both agreed, in their separate and careful ways, needed concluding. The fact of her condition was not apparently something she had considered material to that conclusion, or she would have communicated it through other means before now, and she had not. She had not told him. The full weight of that settled over Arthur in the entrance hall of his family's home, beneath the portrait of his grandfather and the enormous brass chandelier that had hung there since before his birth, while his housekeeper stood at a careful distance, and his footman studied a point on the wall with enormous concentration. She had not told him. She had carried this knowledge through winter and into spring, and through the long months of summer and into autumn, and she had not told him. He tried to understand what that silence meant, and found that he could not yet, not with her standing there in the doorway, looking at him with her composed grey eyes and her burgundy travelling coat, and her hands still holding the handle of her case. And the child, his child, their child, the child that existed in the space between everything they had failed to say to one another, making itself known in every line of her. Partridge, who had managed the Blackthorn household through floods, bereavement, a minor political scandal, and one occasion involving a disputed inheritance, and a visiting earl who had expressed his feelings about the matter rather too loudly in the formal dining room, moved with quiet efficiency into the breach that the Duke's silence had created. She stepped forward. She said something warm and practical about the journey, and the cold and the readiness of a room. And Eleanor, who had always been gracious in the way that came from genuine consideration rather than performance, allowed herself to be guided toward the warmth of the interior, and the moment opened and closed around it like water. And Arthur remained at the foot of the staircase, while his house rearranged itself to accommodate the return of its mistress. He did not follow immediately. He stood where he was, one hand resting on the newel post, and he looked at the empty doorway through which his wife had just passed. And he understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when a man has run out of the ability to avoid understanding, that the version of events he had assembled over the past 7 months, the careful, composed, mutually regrettable version in which two sensible people had arrived at a sensible conclusion, was not, in fact, the complete account. Eleanor was given the room she had always occupied, the suite on the second floor that faced the garden, where the light in the mornings was gentle, and the window seat was wide enough to read in comfortably, and where she had spent a great portion of her time at Blackthorn in the early months of their marriage, before the house had begun to feel less like a place she was learning, and more like a place that was watching her fail to understand it. Mrs. Partridge had fires lit in both rooms before Eleanor's travelling case had been carried up the stairs, and a tray of tea and warm things sent shortly after. And Eleanor sat in the chair nearest the fire and looked at the flames and felt the complicated relief of being in a familiar room while everything else remained unresolved. She had not told him because she had not, for a very long time, known with any certainty that she wished to. That was the honest accounting, and Eleanor had always been in her interior life, if not always in her external conduct, rigorously honest. She had discovered her condition in early April, several weeks after her arrival at Wiltshire, and she had sat with the knowledge in the manner of someone who has been handed something precious and dangerous simultaneously, and is not yet certain how to hold it. She had thought about writing to Arthur. She had, in fact, written the letter 4 times across 4 separate evenings, and on each occasion she had read what she had written, and found it insufficient, not in the quality of the words, but in her understanding of what she actually wished to say. Because the difficulty, the true and abiding difficulty, was not the child. The child was a fact, and Eleanor had always known how to manage facts. The difficulty was what the child represented in the context of everything else. In the context of a marriage conducted with impeccable form and very little genuine intimacy. In the context of a husband who had treated her always with courtesy, and never once with the unguarded quality that would have told her she was truly seen, in the context of her own considerable pride, which had sustained her through the loneliness of those years at Blackthorn, and had ultimately made it possible for her to write that letter in March, and to believe when she wrote it that she was choosing freedom rather than admitting defeat. She had come now because the solicitors had progressed the matter to a point that required her signature on documents that she did not wish to sign in Wiltshire, where her mother would observe and her father would refrain from observing but be aware, and where the space for her own private deliberation would be reduced to nothing. She had come to Blackthorn because she needed to look at Arthur across the space that existed between them, and determine with her own faculties rather than in the abstract distance of correspondence, whether what she was about to finalize was genuinely what she wished to be final. She had not expected him to be at the foot of the staircase when she entered. She had hoped, with a hope she recognized as slightly cowardly, that she might be installed in her rooms and given the afternoon to compose herself before any direct encounter was required. But Arthur had been there, as he had always been, precisely where circumstances demanded, without ever being where she had quietly needed. And she had seen his face when his gaze arrived at its conclusion, and she had watched the composure that defined him encounter something it could not simply contain. That moment, that precise, unguarded moment in which Arthur Pembroke's carefully maintained control had met the undeniable fact of their child, and found itself, briefly, without adequate defences, had told Eleanor more about her husband than 3 years of marriage had managed to communicate. It had told her something she was not yet prepared to fully interpret, but was no longer able to ignore. She rested her hand on the curve of her middle, where the child moved in the slow, deliberate way of the very late months. And she looked at the fire, and she thought about what came next. Dinner that evening was served in the smaller dining room, the one the family used when there were no guests and ceremony could be reduced to its minimum requirements. This was Mrs. Partridge's arrangement, understood by everyone involved to be an act of considerable mercy. The long, formal dining room, with its 12-foot table and its ancestral portraits, and its absolute requirement that two people at either end project their voices across an enormous distance to achieve conversation, would have been unendurable. The small dining room allowed them to sit at a table that could accommodate 6, one at each end, close enough that silence felt intentional rather than geographical. Arthur sat opposite his wife across candles and cold October air coming under the tall windows, and he watched her with the careful attention of a man who is relearning someone he thought he knew. She ate with the appetite of her condition, which was to say with more genuine appetite than he had observed in her during their years of shared meals, when she had always eaten with the moderate restraint of a woman conscious of being observed. The observation cost him something, in the particular way that small truths about the past tend to cost a person retrospectively. She had been conscious of being observed. At his table, in his house, she had eaten with the awareness of his gaze rather than with simple hunger. He had not known that. He had not known many things, and the catalogue of them was growing. The conversation, such as it was, moved across topics of the careful, neutral kind. The state of the roads between Wiltshire and Derbyshire, the earliness of the winter, the progress of certain renovation work on the East Wing that had been underway since summer. These were subjects that required speaking but not saying, and they served their purpose, which was to allow two people to share a table and candlelight and the warmth of a room, without requiring either of them to approach anything that mattered, until they had both steadied themselves enough for the approach to be made with some dignity. It was Eleanor who moved the conversation to what needed to be addressed. She had always been beneath the composure that their shared world had cultivated in her, a woman of courage, not the dramatic, declarative kind, but the quieter kind that is perhaps more difficult to maintain. The kind that simply keeps facing the necessary thing, even when the necessary thing is frightening. She set her fork down and looked at Arthur across the candles, and she said what she had come to say about the documents and the solicitors and the matter that needed resolution. And she said it with the steadiness of a woman who has rehearsed the words until they no longer carry quite as much weight in the saying as they once did. Arthur listened. He was a man who listened well. It was, she had always conceded, among his genuine qualities. And he listened now without interruption, and without the particular quality of waiting that some listeners project, the quality that communicates they are assembling their response rather than receiving what is being said. He listened as though what she was saying was the only thing in the room, which was, she recognized, exactly the quality of attention she had spent years quietly wanting from him, and had never been certain he was capable of. When she finished, the room held the silence for a moment, the candles flickering in some draught from beneath the door, and Arthur said what he had decided in the hours between the entrance hall and this table that he was going to say. He said it carefully, and he said it honestly, which was not his habitual mode, but which the situation had made unavoidable. He said that there were things he had not known, and things he should have known, and that he understood the distinction between those two categories was not, from her position, a distinction that necessarily changed anything. He said that he was asking not for a reversal of her decision, but for time, enough time to have the conversation they had not, in 3 years of marriage, succeeded in having. Eleanor looked at him across the candles. The fire behind him threw his shadow long across the room, and outside the windows the wind had picked up and was moving through the oak trees with the sound of distant water. And the child turned slowly within her, as though adjusting to the particular quality of this moment's gravity.
Nothing more, nothing more.
She said she would stay 3 days. He accepted that as the thing it was, not a concession, not a promise, but a possibility, and the first honest possibility that had existed between them in a very long time. The next morning arrived grey and still, with frost on the garden and the kind of cold that comes in under doors and settles at the base of windows. Eleanor was awake before the light was fully established, which had become her habit in the latter months of her confinement, the child's rhythms having gradually replaced her own. She dressed with the assistance of her lady's maid, who had accompanied her from Wiltshire, and who conducted herself in the manner of a woman who serves an intelligent mistress with perfect discretion about everything she inevitably observed. Eleanor walked in the garden in the early afternoon, which surprised the household, because the garden in late October was not a hospitable place. But she had always found that the quality of her thinking improved in proportion to the amount of cold air she was exposed to, and she needed to think clearly. She walked the path between the dormant rose beds, her breath a small cloud in the sharp air, her coat pulled close, and she thought about what Arthur had said over dinner. Not the words specifically, but the quality beneath them, the quality she had been trying for 3 years to determine whether he actually possessed. He had said he did not know, and he had said he should have known.
I never should have let it
The
come.
first was possible. The second was the admission she had never expected from him, because it required him to accept responsibility not just for a specific failure of communication, but for the conditions that had made such failure inevitable. The distance, the composure, the managed presentation that had characterized his conduct throughout their marriage, and that had left her in room after room and year after year, feeling that she was sharing her life with someone who had decided, for reasons she could not access, that she did not merit his genuine interior. She had told herself in Wiltshire that his silence after her letter was confirmation, that a man who loved his wife, or who was capable of loving in any form that resembled what the word actually meant, would not have read that letter and set it down and done nothing.
The only way
She
I'm
had told
certain of
herself this many times, with the methodical
Why does it
repetition
remain so?
of someone who knows that the argument is correct and is therefore confused by its failure to be entirely convincing. She stopped on the path beside the ornamental pond, which was filmed with ice at its edges and held the flat sky in its center like a mirror. And she thought about the morning she had left. She had come down the stairs with her case and her letter already sent ahead by a footman. And Arthur had been in the entrance hall. She had not expected him there. She had imagined she would simply walk out into the waiting carriage without the particular difficulty of his physical presence. And he had been standing in the entrance hall with his coat already on, as though he had intended to go somewhere. And when he saw her, he had stopped. She had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and neither of them had said anything sufficient, because they were, both of them, people who had learned to distrust the words that came easily. And the words that were actually required were words neither of them had yet learned to say. He had stood at the top of the steps while she descended to the carriage, and when she did not look back, she told herself it was because she could not afford to. And when she finally did look back, when the carriage had turned at the end of the drive and the house was visible through the rear window, that enormous, imposing, beautiful house, he had still been standing there in the cold February morning, watching the carriage go. She had told herself that was obligation, the correct conduct of a duke watching his duchess depart. She had been telling herself variations of that story for 7 months, because the alternative, that a man who watched his wife's carriage disappear through the February mist and then could not bring himself to write a single word in response to her letter, was a man in the grip of something other than indifference. The alternative required her to reconsider conclusions she had expended enormous effort in reaching, and reconsideration at the distance of Wiltshire, with the child growing within her and her pride keeping careful watch at the perimeter, had not been something she was prepared to attempt. She was at Blackthorn now. The distance was gone. The pride was still present, but it was standing at a slightly different angle to everything, as though proximity to the actual situation had caused it to reassess its position. She walked back to the house before the cold became unreasonable, and she found, without having planned it, that she walked toward the East Library rather than toward her own rooms. Arthur was there, as she had in some inchoate way suspected he might be. He was at the desk this time rather than the window, and the desk was covered in papers. Estate papers, correspondence, the endless administrative material of a large property run with genuine attention. And when she entered, he rose, in the reflex of his breeding, and then stopped, because they were past the point where the automatic courtesies could serve as the whole of the communication. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He sat again. The fire in the grate was well established, and the room smelled of books and wood smoke, and the faint pine of the grounds coming in through some gap in the old window casings. And it was, Eleanor realized, the same room in which she had spent some of the most genuinely comfortable hours of her time at Blackthorn, reading in the early mornings before the household fully woke, when the house was still and the library felt like something that belonged to her as much as to anyone. She had not recognized that as significant at the time. She was recognizing it now.
We do not.
They talked,
It's time.
not about the documents, not about the solicitors, not about anything that belonged to the negotiated surface of their situation. They talked in the manner of people who have agreed without stating the agreement to attempt something more difficult and more necessary than they have previously managed. Arthur spoke of the months since her departure with a frankness that cost him something visible. She could see it in the particular quality of his stillness, the way he chose words that were accurate rather than safe, and how the choosing required effort. He spoke of having understood only after the fact that his failure to respond to her letter was not dignity or restraint or the correct conduct of a man in a regrettable situation, but fear, the specific fear of a person who does not know how to ask for what he needs and has consequently constructed an entire edifice of conduct designed to make the needing invisible. Eleanor listened the way he had listened to her at dinner, with her full self turned toward it, not assembling a response, but receiving what was being said. And she heard, in what he was saying, something that she had not been able to hear from Wiltshire, because from Wiltshire it had been too easy to reduce him to the simpler version. The composed, impenetrable, admirably controlled Duke of Blackthorn, for whom she had been an arrangement that had failed to be sufficiently convenient. What she heard was something considerably more complicated and considerably more human than that. She spoke in turn with the honesty that his honesty had made possible. She spoke of the loneliness that had accumulated so slowly and so quietly that she had almost not recognized it for what it was, mistaking it for the natural contraction of a marriage past its first enthusiasm, assuming that what she felt was what all women of her station eventually felt: a settled acceptance, a management of expectation, a decision to locate satisfaction in the duties and occupations available to a duchess, rather than in any genuine communion with the man whose name she bore. She spoke of having told herself, every time she found him inaccessible, that this was simply his nature, and of having come, gradually and painfully, to the conclusion that a nature which kept one's wife at perpetual arm's length was a nature one was within one's rights to withdraw from. She did not speak yet of the child in any terms beyond the practical. The child was present. It was impossible for it not to be present. It was the most physically present thing in the room. But she was not yet ready to lay that particular weight on the conversation, because she needed to know, first, whether what was being said between them was real, or whether it was the performance of honesty. The way their entire marriage had been, perhaps, the performance of something rather than the thing itself. That evening and the next day, and into the grey quiet of the second afternoon, they continued. They walked in the garden together, which they had not done at any point during their marriage, with any intention beyond the requirements of social occasion. Arthur walked at her pace, which was slow, and he did not comment on the slowness. And he did not offer his arm with the air of a man performing an obligation, but simply offered it, and she took it. And they walked among the frost-bitten hedges and the bare trees, while the cold pressed in from all sides, and the sky remained the same uncompromising pewter it had been since her arrival. They talked about things that had nothing to do with their situation, about books, about the village, about a particular family of swans that had claimed the ornamental pond for the past 3 seasons and conducted themselves with an authority that the groundskeeper found vaguely insulting. They talked about things that had happened in the world since March, events Eleanor had read about in her father's newspapers in Wiltshire, events Arthur had followed with the attentiveness of a man with obligations to the political currents of his era. They talked in the way of people for whom conversation has recently become something other than a performance, and who are finding, with some wonder, that they are in fact interested in what the other person has to say. It was in this context, in the particular warmth generated by 2 people who have discovered rather later than ideal that they are genuinely compatible, that the subject of the child was finally approached from the direction that mattered. Not practically, not logistically, not in any way related to what it meant for documents or solicitors or the requirements of inheritance and title, but simply, honestly, as the fact of a new person who was coming into the world and what that person meant to each of them. Arthur stopped on the path beside the pond, where Eleanor had stopped herself the previous morning, and he turned to face her. And he said the thing he had been working toward through 2 days of cautious honesty. He said that he understood she had not told him, and that he was not going to demand an accounting of why, because he understood, or was beginning to understand, what conditions he had created that might have made withholding feel like the only protection available. He said that he was not asking to be forgiven for those conditions, as though forgiveness was something he was owed, because it was not. He said that he was asking only to be given the opportunity to be something other than what he had been. Not because of the child, though the child had rearranged something in him at a depth he was still taking the measure of, but because of her, and because of what these 2 days had shown him was possible between them when they were both willing to set down the things they had been carrying and simply speak. The pond held the grey sky. The frost on the grass caught the thin light and threw it back in small, cold sparks. A rook called somewhere in the oaks, and then was silent. Eleanor looked at her husband, at this man whom she had married and lived beside and not truly known, and who had married her and lived beside her and not truly known her, and who was standing before her now in the cold October afternoon, with his composure at last genuinely in abeyance, offering her something that had no elegant name, but that she recognized unmistakably as the thing she had needed him to offer, and had long since stopped believing he could. And she felt the child move within her, a long, slow shift of weight that pressed against her ribs and reminded her, as it had been reminding her for months, that the future was not abstract. She thought about pride. She thought about what her pride had protected her from, and what it had cost her to be so thoroughly protected. She thought about the letter she had written in March, and the 4 letters she had written in April, and not sent, and the long summer in Wiltshire, during which she had conducted herself with perfect external composure, while conducting, internally, a debate that never reached a satisfactory conclusion. She thought about what she wanted, not what was sensible, not what was defensible, not what could be justified to a world that would observe whatever she decided and form its opinions accordingly. What she wanted, beneath all the careful management of the past 3 years, at the level where the management had never fully reached. She told him she would not sign the documents. Not yet. She told him that what had passed between them over these 2 days was the word she chose, after considering several, was real. She told him it was real, and that she was not certain what it meant for everything that had been set in motion, but that she needed to understand what they were capable of before she concluded that they were capable of nothing. She told him this with the steadiness of a woman making a decision she has arrived at after genuine deliberation, and not the steadiness of composure, which is a different thing entirely. Arthur received this with the particular quality of stillness that Eleanor had spent these 2 days learning to distinguish from his other stillnesses. Not the composure that keeps the world at a measured distance, but the stillness of a man who is very carefully holding something he did not expect to have and does not want to mishandle. He said her name, just that, in the manner of someone using a word for the first time in its actual meaning rather than its functional sense. And she heard, in the single syllable, everything he was not even now able to say outright, because some things require more time and more practice than 2 days and a lifetime of habit can be unlearned in. And she had enough of her own composure remaining to find that acceptable. They walked back to the house together, her arm in his, through the cold and the low light of the October afternoon. And the house rose up before them as it had risen before countless Pembrokes across 2 centuries, imposing, permanent, indifferent to the small human negotiations conducted within its walls. But the light in the windows was warm, and Mrs. Partridge had ordered tea laid in the drawing-room, and somewhere in the upper part of the house, Eleanor's maid was pressing a morning gown, and the fire in the East Library had been kept burning all day. And there was in all of this the feeling of a house that was occupied rather than merely maintained. Eleanor looked at Blackthorn Manor in the fading October light, and felt for the first time that she might understand it. The 3 days became a week. The solicitors were informed through measured correspondence that the matter required further time. Whatever conclusions the respective families drew from this development were conclusions they drew in private, for neither Eleanor nor Arthur had yet communicated anything to anyone beyond what the correspondence required, and the household, which had its own intelligence and its own loyalties, communicated nothing at all. On the 6th day of Eleanor's stay, in the warmth of the East Library, Arthur sat beside her rather than across from her, the way one sits when the desk is no longer needed as a managed distance, and they read for a time without speaking, and the quality of the silence was entirely different from any silence they had previously shared. It was not a silence that concealed or maintained or protected. It was simply the silence of 2 people who have found that they can be in the same room without requiring speech to fill the space between them, and who recognize this as a thing of value. The child arrived as children do, with its own timing and no regard for the scheduling preferences of anyone involved. It arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival at Blackthorn, when the first true snow of the winter was coming down in the long slow curtain that transforms a landscape between one glance and the next. And by the time the household had fully roused itself and the doctor had been sent for from the village, there was nothing to be done but proceed as nature and the exigencies of the situation required. Arthur waited in the room adjacent to Eleanor's suite, in a manner that would have been recognizable to any man who has waited in such rooms before him, which is to say, with his composure occupying exactly none of its usual territory, and his hands for once having nowhere adequate to be. He listened to the sounds that came through the connecting door with the acute attention of a man for whom there is currently nothing else in the world. And he thought about the things that had been said over the past weeks, and the things that had been understood, and the extraordinary and slightly bewildering fact that the sum of those things was adding up, against every expectation, to something he could not yet name, but was quite certain he did not wish to lose. The child was a son. Mrs. Partridge came to tell him herself, which was a courtesy he would not forget. She told him it was a boy, and that both mother and child were well. And she said these things with the professional composure of a woman who has managed many such moments, and with the warmth of one who is, beneath the professionalism, genuinely glad. Arthur thanked her with a gravity that was not performed, and went into the room where his wife lay against her pillows in the blue morning light of the winter window, holding in her arms something very small and very new, and entirely impervious to everything that had preceded its arrival. He sat beside the bed. He looked at the child, at the small, extraordinary face of someone who had decided to exist at the precise intersection of all the things they had almost destroyed. And then he looked at Eleanor, who was looking at him, and the particular quality of exhausted openness that belongs to a woman in the hours after labour had swept away every remaining vestige of everything that had ever stood between them. He reached out and she placed the child's hand in his, the fingers impossibly small and curled with the instinctive grip of the newborn. And the snow continued to fall past the window, and the fire in the grate continued to burn, and the future arranged itself around them in the quiet way of things that are finally, after considerable difficulty and no small amount of grace, beginning to be exactly what they are. The documents that had been prepared by the respective solicitors were, in the fullness of time, set aside, not with ceremony, and not with any declaration that would have invited the attention of the world they both inhabited, simply set aside, in the manner of things that have served their purpose, which was never quite the purpose they appeared to serve, and are no longer needed. In the spring, when the Derbyshire hills turned green again, and the garden at Blackthorn began its annual effort toward beauty, Eleanor walked the path between the rose beds, with the child in his perambulator and Arthur at her side, and they spoke in the ordinary way of people who have agreed, without formal agreement, to try, not to perform a marriage or to maintain the appearance of one, but to actually try, with the honesty they had discovered in October and the practice that honesty required every subsequent day, and the specific patience of two people who understand that the distance between who one has been and who one is capable of being is not closed all at once, but by daily and imperfect effort, and who have decided jointly and with clear eyes that the effort is worth making. It was not a simple love story. Simple love stories belong to people who are simpler than they were. But it was real, and it was theirs, and in the long view of the thing, with the spring light on the garden, and the child awakening to everything, and the house holding them all within its old and indifferent walls, it was enough. It was, if they were honest. And they were becoming together considerably better at honesty, more than enough. It was everything that had been there all along, waiting with extraordinary patience for them to stop being afraid of it. And Blackthorn Manor, which had stood through 2 centuries of human difficulty and human grace, held them quietly, as it had always held what was given into its keeping, and the roses began, unhurriedly, to bloom.